Welcome to the 30-minute hour. It's the personal development podcast for the seven-figure entrepreneur who's looking to level up and become unstoppable. I'm your host, Eric Twiggs, your procrastination prevention partner. Now, my co-host, Ted Fells, will not be joining us on this episode. He is attending a conference, so we definitely wish him well. Today, we're going to talk about 3 HR nightmares that can ruin your dream business. 3 HR nightmares that can ruin your dream business. I was talking to our guest backstage, and I know back when I used to work years ago, when I worked in corporate America, and we would always say that all it really takes is one employee or one situation, and it could just turn into a nightmare from an HR standpoint if it's not handled correctly. I mean, we've seen career plans just ruined and businesses really getting into a lot of hot water and just dealing with HR nightmares that were completely avoidable. So hopefully this episode, I know we've got entrepreneurs that are watching and you're starting to get multiple people working for you. You definitely want to lean in and pay close attention to these 3 HR nightmares, how to avoid them, and how to make sure you're putting the right HR disciplines in place. And even like, when do you get to the point when you should really think about having a serious HR program within your organization? So we'll talk about that, but this is definitely not your everyday podcast. Tom, we do things a little different here on the 30-minute hour. And you can, in addition to watching us on the various Facebook and LinkedIn and YouTube, you can go back and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any of those places where you consume podcast content. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and that way you will never miss an episode. Let's talk about these 3 HR nightmares that can ruin your dream business. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest for the hour. He is a 30-year veteran in the human resources industry. He's got experience spanning manufacturing plants, retail stores, Fortune 500 companies. And he's got HR experience across the United States, as well as Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And he currently works for the Preferred CFO as the VP of Human Resources. Preferred CFO provides HR, finance, accounting, and payroll services for companies. Please join me in welcoming to the 30-minute hour, Tom Applegarth.
Thank you, Eric.
Hey, Tom, welcome to the 30-minute hour. It is definitely an honor to have you on the show. So I want to start from the beginning. Back when you were an undergraduate at BYU, what was the vision that you had for your career back then?
Well, when I was an undergraduate, I wasn't really planful about my career. And I loved history. I loved reading about history. I loved learning about history. And so I majored in history. And so after I graduated, I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And didn't really like any of the possibilities that I was looking into. So I decided to continue and get my master's in business from BYU. So I went into their MBA program. And the first year of the MBA program, they have you take finance and accounting and operations and marketing and organizational behavior, and HR was one of the classes. And Stephen R. Covey had been a professor at Brigham Young University, but had written his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, really about 2 years before I went into the business program. So he had quit being a professor and was off promoting his book and making millions of dollars, but he was still a big influence on campus and would come back and give lectures. And so a combination of his influence and the HR class that I had to take during the first year of the MBA program really made me decide that, human resources was what I wanted for a career, and so that's how I got started. And then Amoco
Interesting.
came to campus and recruited for HR talent, and I went to work for them, and that's how I started in HR, and I've been in HR ever since.
Andrew, did you get to actually talk to Stephen Covey much, or?
Not a lot. I did ask one question in one of his lectures, but there was like 200 or 300 people in the class, so that
Right.
was about as close as I got.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, no, that's awesome. That's awesome. So knowing what you now know, if you could go back and be a mentor to that younger version of yourself, what advice would you give?
I think one of the things as I was starting out, I was really anxious about my career, and I moved, so I moved from Provo to Chicago to work for Amoco, and then I moved to Kansas and worked for Payless ShoeSource. Then I moved to Dallas and worked for Flowserve, and moved up to Cleveland and worked for Goodyear Tire Rubber Company. And so I moved around a lot in my career. And in hindsight, as I'm a mentor, I think that I may have moved a little too frequently. And as I get older, and now I have grown children, I've kind of deposited them all around the United States. And so getting to see them requires plane travel in most circumstances, which is maybe the one thing I should have thought through a little better is how do I kind of keep my kids a little closer, and that may or may not have happened, but it was good for my career for sure. But now makes me get on a plane to go see my kids when I want to go see them, but that's okay, I guess.
Yeah, I find that because we were talking backstage. I spent some time where I lived in upstate New York, and I think it does help to round you out, and I think it helps you to embrace uncertainty, right? Because one thing if
Sure.
you're in your hometown, you know everything, you know everybody knows you. There's another thing when you go relocate somewhere remote. So it gets you because I think to be successful in life and business, it requires embracing uncertainty.
Sure. No, I think you're right. Absolutely. No,
Yeah,
I definitely learned a lot by making a lot of those moves and changes for sure.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then, so you're currently the vice president of human resources for Preferred CFO. So, who's Preferred's ideal customer and how specifically do they help them?
Yeah, so most of our customers are relatively small companies and companies that can't afford expert talent in finance, accounting, or HR. And so, it's when you're a small company, it's hard to really afford a full-time person with the level of expertise that your company can really benefit from. And so we provide those services on a fractional basis where you can get access to a very seasoned CFO or CPA or HR person, and they're there to help your business and part of the team, but they're also working for 3 or 4 or 5 other companies,
Mhm.
and allows small companies to have access to that type of talent without the expense of hiring somebody full time.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I think a lot of times when people start businesses, they have what's called that entrepreneurial seizure, where they feel like, you know what, I can do this. I don't have to work for this guy. I can do this on my own. But from my experience of just coaching various entrepreneurs, one of the huge things that trips them up is the whole accounting piece in the financing piece and the finance piece and really understanding cash flow and all of that. So I take it that you help businesses like with financial planning, budgeting, forecasting, and all of that too.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And you're exactly right. There's very profitable businesses that don't understand their cash flow. And that's the single biggest reason why companies end up going out of business. They may be very profitable, but if you don't have the cash to pay your bills, that's what causes companies to really fail.
Yeah, no, that's that's very true. So I think, I mean, that sounds like a tremendous resource. And then especially if somebody's not in a position where they feel like they can bring on a full-time CFO, they can just basically use this company and have that service. So now, so you've been 30 plus years in HR experience. So when is a good time for an entrepreneur to consider adding like an official HR program to their, like, how do they know when it's time?
I don't think once you have employees, even with your first employee, there are things that can go drastically wrong. And so I think it's good to start to make sure that you're putting in the right processes, policies, that you're handling things the way that you need to from a legal perspective. So I think once you hire your first employee, you're going to have to pay them correctly and you're going to have to follow the laws. And so it's good to start having somebody help you with that if you're not an expert. And I think you're exactly right, Eric. One of the mistakes I see a lot of owners of businesses make is they try and be the expert in everything. It's hard to be the expert in everything. And so whatever areas that you're not the expert, rather than spending a lot of time and energy trying to become an expert in that area, I think it's always good to leverage others who are experts, and then you can spend more time in the area that you are an expert and grow your business, and have a lot more time to grow your business.
And now more than ever, I think it's just critical to have an HR program. Like you say, even if you've got one employee, I think you need to really be thinking about what your HR program is and getting help with that, because it's like we live in a litigious society, and everybody has an attorney, and and you'd be surprised at how versed employees are with HR law, and they know who to call, and they know, oh, you know what, this and that is going on. So definitely, so I think this is a good time, Tom, for us to transition into the HR nightmares. So let's start. There's three main HR nightmares that can ruin a dream business if you don't get on top of it. So let's start with HR nightmare number one.
I think hiring the wrong people is the first nightmare that any business can make. It is really, really costly if you hire someone who doesn't work out. And so I'm just a big believer in take your time when you're hiring somebody. Make sure you're spending a lot of time with them to make sure they have the skill sets that you need, that that they fit from a cultural perspective, and that you're really confident that they're going to work out. And I really believe in doing a lot of background checks as well. Not only kind of, criminal background checks, which is a good one to do, to know, not that you should never hire somebody who has a criminal background, but you should know about it and talk to them about it and make sure that it's going to work in your organization. And then equally important is talking to their past managers. Now, when somebody's actively working, they're not going to want you to talk to people at their, to their current manager most of the time. And that's totally understandable. But the manager that they worked for 2 or 3 years ago is a key person that you want to talk to, and other references, because you'll gain a lot of insight by talking to people that they worked with in the past and talking to them about, hey, here's what I'm going to have the person do. How do you think they're going to perform? How did they perform when they worked for you? And you can gain a lot of valuable information. So it's hard to spend too much time selecting the right person, but it's really, really important. And it's often tempting for people to just, not spend as much time because everybody's busy, but hiring the wrong person can end up costing you a lot of money and really cause problems. So I think that's the number one thing to do.
So what do you say to the entrepreneur watching this now that says, you know what, reference checks is a waste of time because, these former bosses don't want to say anything. All they're going to say is, oh, this person just worked here from these dates. And so what's your response to that?
You would be surprised. I hear that a lot, but I personally do a lot of reference checking. And for sure, you end up with some people that either won't return your call or won't do anything but verify dates. But there is probably 70-80% of the people I talk to are giving you a reference. And like anything else, if you spend a little time, establish a little rapport, make sure they understand this is going to be very confidential. It's never going to get back to the applicant. They'll start to open up, and you can read between the lines as well. They may not be totally explicit, but you can, in a video chat or in a phone conversation, you can tell and get some more information, and then you need to follow your gut. Some of the biggest mistakes I ever made was early in my career where you're like, that was kind of a strange reference. And then, we ended up hiring the person anyways. And it was a big mistake. And in hindsight, you're like, I think that person was trying to tell me something. And it was not a full-throated, wonderful endorsement. And it's hard because oftentimes you need help. There's work that's just not getting done. It's spilling on the floor. It's the most tempting thing to do, to go ahead and say, oh, they'll probably be okay. And that is usually a mistake. If you're not getting great references and everything's not making sense as you interview and really do the background and reference checking on an employee, you probably ought to pass and wait until you have somebody that you're just like, yes, everything's clicking. Let's go ahead and bring that person on board.
Yeah, and people I work with, I advise them to have what I call the heck yes or no policy. So if you're interviewing somebody, in your gut, it should feel like, oh, heck yes, I'm going to bring her on and she's going to help move me forward. If it's not a heck yes, I think it's better to keep it moving.
Absolutely. No question about it.
Yeah. And then the other thing, as far as with the references, like I was always looking for A players. So for me, if 3 references would only tell me the bare minimum, that's a sign. Because if somebody's great, think about this, Tom. If somebody is great and they work for you, you want to help them, right? So you'd say, oh man, Eric was excellent. And the only reason he's not working for me now is he relocated, but I would hire him back in a heartbeat.
Absolutely. Nope, that's absolutely right. I agree with that.
I think these are all things that we need to be thinking about. But Tom, I am with you. I think the biggest nightmare is just bringing in the wrong person. And I think people get, I'm shorthanded and I'm just going to check the box and get this off my plate. But no, I think that's the critical step. So number one of the HR nightmares is hiring the wrong person. So we need to get that right. So I'm assuming in your HR services, you provide resources. You do interviews. Like, how do you help entrepreneurs to get it right?
Yeah, absolutely. We will do the finding of candidates, interviewing candidates, reference checking, and running the selection process for companies. So that's definitely one of the services that we provide.
Okay. All right. No, that's a nice service there for sure. All right. HR nightmare number 2.
Well, if you've made that mistake and hired the wrong person, the next biggest mistake you can make is terminating somebody the wrong way.
Oh.
You need to be very careful about terminating somebody. And it starts with communicating. So when an employee is not doing well, you need to start coaching them and helping them understand what they're not doing well, and keeping that documentation. The documentation is key, because if it gets to a situation where you're like, you know what, it's just time for us to terminate this employee, that documentation is going to be very helpful in case they decide to go file a charge with the EEOC or find an attorney. That documentation is going to be the thing that saves you, because it's certainly legal to terminate people. But if they allege that the reason that you terminated them was an illegal reason because of their race, sex, age, disability, or whatever, it's going to be that documentation of, no, here's all the conversations I had with them, and here's where the performance issues that they were having and why I needed to terminate them. That's going to be your legal defense. And then the other thing I'm just a big believer of is, when you terminate somebody, offer them a severance package. It doesn't need to be a lot. Maybe it's just a couple weeks pay, but offer them a severance package if they will sign a waiver not to sue you. It's just cheap insurance, because, a lot of people, most people will sign a waiver for, 2 or 3 weeks pay. And once they sign that waiver, they have given up their right to go find, lawyers won't even talk to them. If they go find a lawyer and the lawyer contacts you, all you have to do is send them a copy of that waiver and it's over. If you don't have that and the lawyer is hungry or decides to take it on contingency for some reason, I've had cases where we spend, where we're in the right, we have all the documentation, we end up winning, but we end up spending $50,000 or $60,000 on our attorney to defend us. And so it's just cheap insurance. 2 or 3 weeks pay, if somebody will sign a waiver, is cheap insurance in my book.
So at a minimum, if somebody doesn't do, the necessary documentation, that person can collect unemployment.
Sure.
So you have the unemployment expense, but like you're saying, it could also, and I've seen this where it evolves into this massive lawsuit, especially if the person is in a protected class. Now they're saying that it's because of their race, gender, whatever, and not the performance issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's always a risk. Anytime you terminate somebody, there's a legal risk, but there's ways to mitigate that legal risk, and documentation and offering them a little bit of severance if they'll sign a waiver not to sue you are two of the most important ones.
And so again, so as far as your service, so if somebody, let's say I'm working with you. So how would you help me with that whole process? Would I say, hey, I've got Mary and I'm ready to terminate Mary, she's just not cutting it. Like, how would you help me?
Yeah. So even before we get to that, we're training, we're offering training and helping train managers and the owner on, documentation and performance management. So we try and help get to that situation, help prevent getting to that situation where I just need to fire Mary, and no, I really haven't even given her any feedback, or, that's not good to get in that situation. But sometimes you do get in that situation, or somebody's been doing fine and all of a sudden they do something where you're like, they just have to go. Yeah, they were doing fine, but they just made a huge mistake or did something unethical or something where we just need to terminate them. But throughout that entire process, we're there to help put in strategies to mitigate the process. So when it does happen, and it happens all the time, where a manager or an owner is like, I just need to terminate Mary right now, and maybe we didn't put in all the documentation. Well, okay, let's look at the risk and let's weigh the pros and the cons, and walk through the process of, do you really need to terminate Mary now? what's our legal risk? Because there's times when the legal risk can vary. I mean, if somebody stole money from you, yeah, terminating them now, and you can prove that they stole money from you. You probably don't need any more documentation than that, and we can terminate them, and there's probably very little legal risk. If it's no, they've had, they just really haven't been doing a good job for their entire time they've worked here, but I've never given them any feedback, and I'm now terminating them, and they're the only person in that protected class, or they just made a complaint to OSHA about the safety of the facility, and now we've decided to terminate them. There's different situations where I'm like, well, you can do whatever you want to do, but this is a huge legal risk. And so rather than terminating them now, we probably ought to put a plan in place where we're building that documentation that we haven't built, probably should have built, but we haven't. And now we need to put that in place. And if they don't improve, maybe a month or two from now, we'll terminate them. But, regardless, there's times when, owners decide and managers decide, I'm going to take that legal risk. And that's where the size of the severance comes into play. So maybe you would have only offered them 2 or 3 weeks if we had done everything correctly and we had relatively low risk. But no, we didn't do things correctly, but that person has to go. Well, we probably want to offer them a lot more than 2 or 3 weeks to get them to sign a waiver not to sue us, because there is a lot of legal risk in this situation. So we help coach people through those types of decisions to make sure that we make the best decision for the company.
And are you a believer in the whole progressive disciplinary process where it's a verbal warning and then 3 written warnings? And
yeah, I mean, I don't think I don't think you can always that there is a pattern where, yes, every single time we're going to give somebody 1 written warning, 1 verbal warning, 3 written warnings, and then we're going to terminate them. But in general, that's a very good approach. Let's first talk to them about it. If they're not performing the way that they should, let's give them a written warning. And written warnings are very powerful because people will go back and reread them many, many times. And then it's providing the documentation that, you will be very helpful in case you end up terminating them and they end up going and getting an attorney. So I am a big believer in, progressive discipline. It doesn't, there may be times when you decide that you're going to do extra written warning or a final warning, and other times where maybe you end up terminating them more quickly. And a lot of that will just depend on the situation and the legal risk that's involved.
Yeah, and during my years as a supervisor, I mean, having at times 500 people working for me, I honestly didn't like having to separate or terminate people. But one of the things that helped me was following the progressive disciplinary process, because I knew that, hey, I gave this person every chance and it wasn't the right job, or they just refused to comply. But I've communicated this to them every way possible. They have made a decision. So I could sleep better at night.
Yep.
And I think there's some people listening to me now that honestly, they don't like having to have those types of conversations. But I think following that process helps with that. What do you think?
Absolutely. No, I think following that process helps with it. And it also helps all the other employees know that it's just not an arbitrary decision. Even though you're not communicating every detail, but if employees know that there's a process in place, and it's not that the boss is going to wake up tomorrow and just decide to terminate somebody, but there is a process where employees will be treated fairly and will have an opportunity to understand what they're not doing well and where they need to improve, then that just helps you attract and retain better employees than if it is arbitrary, and the boss just wakes up one morning and says, I can't take it anymore. This person's been doing a horrible job. I should have told them, but I didn't. But I just can't take it anymore and they need to go. Well, that's not the type of company that most employees want to work in.
For sure. For sure. That kind of, there's a book out called Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And she talks about, that you think avoiding the difficult conversation is a good thing, but it's not, that you're really doing the person more harm. And she tells a story about how, I think she was with Google or a company like that. And she terminated somebody without having those conversations. And the person was like, well, why didn't you just tell me that before? I could have made some improvements. So I think that one of the takeaways from this episode is that we can't shy away from those conversations. We just need to make sure we're following the documentation process here. So this is great. So those of you just joining us, Tom Applegarth, he's our HR guru. And we're talking about the 3 HR nightmares that can ruin a dream business. Number one is hiring the wrong person. And by the way, let me tell you, I've made so far, I don't know the third one yet, but I've made these 2 mistakes plenty of times. So I'm not saying I'm holier than thou. I've made these mistakes and had to learn the hard way. So number one, he said hiring the wrong person. Number 2, he said terminating someone the wrong way. So now let's get to number 3. What's the third HR nightmare?
The third one is following all of the laws that the state, local, and federal government has passed, which is not an easy task, which is one of those reasons why it's good to have an HR expert on your team. And one of them, so we could talk about this topic all day, but one that I see incorrectly and not followed the most is whether or not you pay an employee overtime. So the Fair Labor Standards Act is very specific about who you must pay time and a half for every hour worked over 40 in a week, and who you don't have to pay time and a half. And there's a lot of companies that don't know exactly what the rules are and are not paying people overtime that should pay them. And there's several companies that I've worked with over the years that have ended, and all it takes is one employee to call the Department of Labor, and they're more than happy to come in and do an audit, and they'll audit every single position in the company. And I've been through this a couple of times, and it's a very painful process. And then they then render their opinion on which positions you should have been paying overtime to that you haven't been. And then they ask the employee to tell them how many hours have you worked each week for the last 2 years. And you're just writing the employee a blank check, because if you haven't been paying them by the hour, you probably haven't been having them keep track of the time, either on a time clock or in some other process. And so the Department of Labor will just take the employee's word at it unless you can provide proof that's different than what the employee provides. And then you have to pay that back pay for the last 2 years in whatever amount of time the employee said they worked every week for the last 2 years. And that can be a very, very costly mistake. And there's many others that we could talk about, but there's the laws that have been passed that you just need to make sure you're following. And if you don't know what they are as the owner of a business, you either ought to spend a lot of time educating yourself on what they are, or you ought to get somebody to help you to make sure that you're following all of these different laws that exist in our great country.
Great point. And I'm going to say this is going to be controversial, Tom. I think anybody that's operating a business in the state of California needs to just call you right now because California is the exception to every rule. and you have to be. That's just there's other states too,
Sure.
but California particularly just comes to mind, just because a lot of the issues over the years I've had one way or another with California not following these rules and all of that. But yeah, definitely that's why it helps to have an HR partner, somebody that's aware of the various rules. And because I agree with you again, you're right. The overtime laws and it varies depending on where you are, and it's good to have somebody that's on top of that. Because I have yet to see one of these audits, because I've heard about a lot of entrepreneurs who've had these audits. I'm not aware of one that went well for the business owner.
That's right. No, when the Department of Labor comes, it's rare that they don't find something. It's like any auditor, they're gonna dig until they find something for sure.
Yeah. No one has said, "Hey, Twigs, I had an audit and it went great. I passed it with flying colors. I'm just so happy they were here." No, doesn't work that way.
Right. No
So
question.
definitely want to make sure you get that squared away. So again, 3 HR nightmares that can ruin a dream business: hiring the wrong person, terminating someone the wrong way, following all the labor laws. Is there another nightmare, like a bonus nightmare you can think of that you run into a lot with different business owners?
Yeah, I think not paying attention to the cost of turnover. So we talked a little bit about it, but people, for each business it's a little different. But I don't think that most businesses realize the cost of their turnover. I've worked for several different companies where they had very high turnover, and when we got the easy first thing to always look at is, are your pay and benefits competitive for the type of talent that you're trying to attract? And if it's not, that's the first cause of turnover. If it is, then there's probably other causes that we need to go into. But many different companies that I've worked with have been able to actually save money by increasing what their pay and benefits are, because they decrease turnover, and that cost of turnover is so high. When you really spend time looking at, all right, I hire somebody and they're not fully productive for 3, 4, 5 months or even longer. And the longer that learning curve is, the more expensive turnover is, because that's where a lot of the hidden cost is, because you're paying that person like they're being fully productive. But every single job, it takes people some period of time before they're as productive as the people that have been there for a year or 2 or 3 or whatever. And not paying attention to that cost of turnover and really working hard to figure out how you decrease your turnover and what you need to do to decrease your turnover is one of the hidden costs that people a lot of times don't even realize they're spending, but it's very costly to a business.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, just the time it takes to find a good person. You just have to start that circle all over again. So it takes the entrepreneur's productivity goes down, and the customer potentially seeing a different face. And yeah, so definitely great point. Great point. So I know you get asked a lot of questions by a lot of different people. I'm just curious, like what's one question that you never get asked that you wish more people would ask you?
There's I have been amazed at companies that have a great 401k program, and they match the money that employees put into the program. And on average, most companies have a 401k program and they're matching 3% or more of what the employees contribute. And I am always amazed that in most companies, half or 40, 50% of the employees aren't taking advantage of that free money. They're not contributing to their 401k to get the free money that their employer is offering them. And so the question I never get asked from people is, but I wish they would ask is, how much money do I need to retire? Because if you're giving away free money, you're not saving in your 401k. There's very few companies outside of the government these days that have their traditional pension plan. And I think as a society, we're just, going to be in a world of hurt because for many of the people that have retired and are retiring, they're of the age that they have a traditional pension plan. We're just starting to get into because those pension plans started to disappear in the 80s and 90s. Right. And so we've got this, everybody that started working, in the late 80s or early to mid 90s, when they start retiring, the average person only has $200,000 in their 401k as savings. Wow. That is not enough. That is not enough. And so I really worry about all of these people that haven't contributed to their 401k and haven't saved for retirement. They're going to be living on $2,000 or $3,000 of Social Security, which is probably not the type of lifestyle that most of them have been enjoying while they're working.
That's a scary thought because you have to figure with inflation and the cost of living and everything is getting just more and more expensive. So, $200,000 years from now isn't going to be much at all. I think that's a question. That's a question I wish more people would ask you. That's for sure. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So we're coming down the home stretch. We're at the final segment. It's called Write This Down. And this is where we'll both go around and give at least one idea from today's episode that the people need to write down so they can level up. So Tom, you're the guest of honor. What do people need to write down from this episode?
So I think all of the business owners and managers that listen to your podcast need to write down, I am not going to try and be the expert in everything. I think they really need to take an evaluation of themselves. What am I the expert in? And the areas in my business where I'm not the expert, how do I plug that gap? How do I make sure that I have A-level talent in every area of my company? Because nobody wants to have B and C level talent, but most people are going to have strengths and they're going to have weaknesses. And you need to figure out, how do I make sure that where I'm not the expert and where I'm weak, how do I bring in resources to make sure that I'm an A player in my business across all of the areas? And you can absolutely go broke saving money.
Ooh. Can you say that again? Say that again for the people in the back.
You can go broke saving money. You need to invest in your business in the right areas and spend money so that your business can grow and be successful. And sometimes when you are trying to save money in the wrong areas, it ends up costing you way more money than you ever saved.
We call that stepping over $1 to pick up a dime.
Right.
You can go broke saving money. Whew. Absolutely. You don't have to be an expert in everything. Write that down. So my contribution to this Write This Down segment is just something I just believe. And it's along the lines of what you're saying. I just think that success is a team sport. And you look at, there's always this talk about who's the GOAT, right? You look at sports, who's the greatest of all time? Who's the GOAT? Well, most people that are in that GOAT conversation, they had a great team around them. We think it's them. We think, oh yeah, it's just Michael Jordan. He was just a great individual, or LeBron James, or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, or Tom Brady. They were just great as individuals, but they were surrounded by a team. They had a great coach. They had other complementary great players. And it's the same thing in business. that the people who you would think of as the GOAT that have done very well. And even we talked about Stephen Covey earlier. I would bet you he's got some great people around him behind the scenes. You never saw them, but they were helping him. It wasn't just him, being as prolific as he is. So I think you have to think about it as a team sport. And Mr. or Miss Business Owner, who is the team? Who are you surrounding yourself with? Is it a coach? Is it an HR company? I think that's how you have to think. Success is a team sport. And I think you avoid these HR nightmares if you're surrounding yourself with the right team.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you.
All right. This has been a fantastic episode of the 30-Minute Hour podcast. Tom, thank you for everything you've shared. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Yep, you can go to preferredcfo.com, or if you just Google Tom Applegarth HR, I'm on the first page every time.
All right. preferredcfo.com, Tom Applegarth. Again, thank you. And for those of you listening, watching, don't forget to share the show. Don't keep this episode to yourself. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the 30-Minute Hour podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any of those places. That way, you never miss a future episode. That's our time for this week. And until next time, have a great one.